Justice, for those. All right. Well, thank you so much. And so I know we haven't met since the beginning of the calendar year. So Happy New Year to you and welcome. I hope that this year becomes an incredibly productive and prosperous one for all of us, and one marked by peace, given what the world has gone through the last year or so. Anyway, so today we are delighted to begin our regular monthly webinar, starting this year with this one. We are very privileged to have Todd Moss, who is the Executive Director of the Energy for Growth Hub in Washington, D.C. He's our non-resident fellow for the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Becker Institute and a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development. So I'm going to read this bio because I think it's worth reading, especially towards the end, which is my favorite part of this bio. Anyway, Moss had served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs at the Department of State and has worked at the World Bank, the London School of Economics, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. He is, of course, the author of numerous articles and books, including African Development, Making Sense of the Issues and Actors, and Oil to Cash, Fighting the Resource Curse with Cash Transfers. He holds a PhD and a Master of Science from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies and a bachelor's from Tufts University. So this is the part that I think is important for all of you who are crisis managers, right? Moss is the author of an international thriller series from Penguin's Putnam Books about a State Department crisis manager. So this thriller series include The Golden Hour, Minute Zero, Ghosts of Havana, and The Shadow List. Todd, welcome, and looking forward to hearing your wisdom today. Over to you.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Justice. It's an honor to be with you, and I appreciate the plug for my books as well. I think what would make let's go right, if it's okay, I'll share my screen.
Okay, so please, when you're not speaking, mute yourself so that we can hear the interpreters. So Todd, over to you.
Great, thank you. Can everyone see the slides now with the title screen? Is that working? Okay, so thanks again, Andrew, and thank you to Justice for inviting me. So just very briefly, my organization, the Energy for Growth Hub, is a nonprofit research group. We're dedicated to using data and analysis to end global energy poverty. We generally work behind the scenes with different government actors to provide data and analysis. So think of us as like a backroom analytical group. Rather than on the stage, we like to provide the data and analysis that decision makers like yourselves can use. So if people want to get in touch with me, please do that through the World Bank. Just as context for this talk, I think it goes without saying that ending energy poverty is critical to meeting all of the development goals that we have for the world, especially in Africa. There's also a big equity issue. Because we're going to need a lot more energy if we're going to create jobs, if we're going to support better health and education, and especially for industrialization. There is no path to industrialization without orders of magnitude more energy consumption. And we'll talk about that. And third, there's a climate change angle. And climate change is obviously affecting the continent greatly, but we have to make sure that we're bringing everyone along. And that's going to mean a lot more energy, not less energy. So the climate change agenda in Africa is about energy abundance. It's not about energy austerity. Now, does the world recognize all of this? In some ways, yes. So we have SDG number 7. It's my favorite SDG, of course, which says that the world is going for universal access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Now, this sounds good, but the way that we're measuring it is actually a problem for economic growth. All countries want to get to this goal of universal access, which is to get 100% of the population to have modern energy. But the way we're doing it is actually creating a lot of problems for other economic goals that countries have. Now, Africa overall is the region with the most unmet energy demand, and where the lack of reliable energy is the greatest obstacle to job creation. We'll hear a little bit about Justice Mensah's terrific work in that area. And there's a new window of opportunity because of the attention on climate change, and the availability of climate finance could be very helpful for helping to build Africa's energy infrastructure, but only if we're able to meet what I call 3 big challenges. And that's one, that energy targets are defined ambitiously enough. Second, that our energy goals match our development objectives. And third, that emissions mitigation, control of greenhouse gas emissions, is put in context. It's important, but it needs to be in context. And if any of these 3 challenges are missed, Africa is at great risk of being left behind, not just in the energy transition, but in the next wave of global economic growth. So I will quickly run through each of these 3 challenges, along with possible initial steps to meet these challenges. These are kinds of things that each of your governments could be thinking about with your World Bank partners. But I do want to say the starting point is that energy is among the worst examples of global inequality. The scale of inequity is just huge. This is one of my most used graphics, which is per capita electricity consumption in several countries. And the orange bar is what my household refrigerator uses in a year. So a world in where a basic household appliance uses more electricity than people in an entire year is obviously not one of justice or of equity. Now, while this is bad at the individual per capita level, it's also bad at the economy-wide level. Here is this is total electricity consumption by country, and the orange bar at the top is the amount of electricity used in the United States to play video games, just to play video games. And that is more electricity than the entire economy of Nigeria and lots of other countries. So again, an example of extreme energy inequality. And of course, we're economists, so we care about economic growth, and energy inequality matters at the macroeconomic scale too, because there is no such thing as a high-income country that is a low energy economy. So just to explain this graph very briefly, this is, we have all countries. You have electricity consumption per capita on the y-axis and income per capita on the x-axis. These are both logged scales, so you can see. And obviously, electricity consumption and income are pretty tightly correlated. But what's very interesting is that every single high-income country per capita electricity is over 4,000 kilowatt hours per person. In the United States, it's 13,000 kilowatt hours per person. There are very few African countries above 500, and many countries, including Nigeria, is below 150. So we're really talking orders of magnitude. And that empty red circle in the bottom is just suggestive that the only way countries can become wealthier is in part through much, much higher electricity consumption. And we've got to go from 200, 300, 400 kilowatt hours to 1,000, 2,000, and eventually get everyone to something in the order of 5,000 kilowatt hours. So that's the starting point for where we are. The first challenge I want to share is around defining energy ambitiously enough. The UN, I mentioned for SDG 7, it does track progress, but what does it mean to have modern access? So it could mean that your home is connected to a physical wire. It could mean how much electricity you consume in a year. And the International Energy Agency sets that standard. And the consumption minimum, if you live in a city, is 100 kilowatt hours per year per person. If you live in the rural areas, it's only half that, 50 kilowatt hours per person per year. Now, this is a little bit of a strange metric because, first of all, it's too narrow because the SDGs equate modern energy with just electricity at home. It's only measuring homes, people, the electricity consumed at home and homes connected. However, we know that the vast majority of electricity in the world is not used at home. Only about a quarter of global electricity is used at home. The vast majority is used in industry and commerce. And this slide is just electricity. If we did all energy, household electricity is only 5% of the total. So what we're doing is we're measuring a very narrow slice of what is needed for a modern life and for a modern economy. And I like to think of the analogy that we want to create an educated workforce for the jobs of the 21st century. But if we just picked a basic literacy as our measure of success, that's how narrow this particular goal is. So it's very narrow. The second is obviously, as I suggested with the numbers, it's too low. 100 kilowatt hours per person per year is in no way modern. 100 kilowatt hours per person per year is enough for lights. You could charge your mobile phone. Maybe you can operate a small fan, but you're not running a television. You're not running a refrigerator. You're definitely not running an electric cook stove, and you're absolutely not going to be able to run air conditioning. So the access threshold that we use is more like an extreme energy poverty line than it is a definition of modern access. So we're really right now not defining electricity ambitiously enough. So what could be done? What could be done here to meet this challenge? The first is obviously countries should try to meet 100% household access, but also set national generation targets that would be tied to job creation. Job creation is really what can be unlocked with new energy investments. So national generation targets intimately interlinked to industrialization and job goals, in addition to household electrification. The second is really to not allow the push for household access to become an impediment to growth. And we could talk more about this in the questions, but there are many countries, for understandable reasons, want to expand the grid to connect as many people. in many cases, this is bankrupting the national utility and undermining the ability of the national utility to serve its industrial and commercial customers. So that's an economic problem to avoid. And finally, the third thing to do is to set goals beyond household access. So for income, every country has income goals, and you have a poverty goal. You want to eradicate poverty, but that's not your only goal. You don't just want everybody to get to $2. You want people to get to $5, $10, and hopefully higher levels of income. Well, we can do the same with energy. And it's through something called the Modern Energy Minimum, which is a new threshold set at 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, and it covers both household and non-household electricity. I will show you a quick little graphic here. This is another scatter plot that shows how different levels of electricity are correlated with different levels of income. And so 100 kilowatt hours, our current threshold, correlates with less than $1 of income a day. The 1,000 kilowatt hour modern energy minimum correlates with about $7 per day, and it's right in the median of the lower middle income group. Now, this new modern energy minimum, if you haven't heard of it, it's just recently been proposed, including by us and the Rockefeller Foundation. We're working with Sustainable Energy for All on this. And energy ministers have signed on to this through Sustainable Energy for All. And I think there'll be more advocacy for using this 1,000 kilowatt hours, not to replace household access, but as the second step. So the first step is get everybody to 100 kilowatt hours. The next step is to get everybody to 1,000 at home and in the wider economy. And I can come back to that if there's more. So that's the first major challenge, being ambitious enough. The second major challenge is matching energy to development goals. And by this, I mean jobs. So universal household electrification is important, but it is not going to contribute to economic growth. For growth, countries need energy used by industry, agriculture, and commerce. And what does business need? Business doesn't care about the access rate. Business cares about affordability and reliability. On the flip side, when you don't have affordable and reliable power, you have outages. And the evidence is pretty clear, including by a terrific paper by Justice Mensah, which shows the tremendous damage done to job creation from power outages. And I like to think of Ghana as a good example of this challenge. So at one level, Ghana is a tremendous energy access success story. In 2000, the access rate was only around 45% of the population. Today, it's over 85%. At the same time, Ghana has experienced, terrible outages. They even have a term, dumsor. Ghana has very high electricity prices in the range of 14 to 28 cents a kilowatt hour. And when the power is out and firms have to run a diesel backup, they're paying more than 50 cents a kilowatt hour. And so if you're a Ghanaian firm, you have a very high access rate, but you're paying a lot for reliable electricity. And if you're trying to compete, for example, with a country like Vietnam, Vietnam has 7-cent electricity, 7 cents a kilowatt hour, and the reliability is more than 99%. So again, in Ghana, this is a good example of where the access, you're making progress, the country's making great progress on access, but you still have an economic growth drag because the power is not cheap or reliable enough. So what to do about that? Again, quickly, one is generation really needs to focus on large scale power for industry and commerce, not just households. Second is really to look at affordability and reliability. And here I would like to flag a really important issue that has not gotten enough attention, particularly among the economists in government, which is around contract transparency. So right now, when countries sign mining or oil and gas contracts, there's an expectation that the contract terms will be disclosed. But in the power sector, this does not hold. Power purchase agreements are still kept secret. Even the existence of some power purchase agreements are kept secret. And the reason for it is because utilities may say we're a private entity, we're not a government entity, but every one of those contracts comes with a public guarantee. And as all economists will know, secret contracts mean non-competitive pricing. So Africa is never going to have highly competitive electricity pricing while the contracts remain secret. If anybody would like to follow up with me, we've got an entire legal team working on contract disclosure norms in the power sector. I'd be delighted to talk to you about it. And let me just add the third issue under this challenge is leveraging extractive industries for lower cost, reliable power. So it is, especially in the countries that are exporting minerals or gas or oil. Now, there's a dirty secret of global finance, which is that there is plenty of private investment available for gas and oil infrastructure in Africa if those resources are being exported to Europe or Asia. But for domestic investment, that is very, very scarce. And those investments require some kind of government guarantee or IFC involvement or another DFI to guarantee those contracts. And this has created a very bizarre situation where a country like Senegal can finance infrastructure for its gas for export to Europe, but it will have a very difficult time finding finance, including from European institutions, to finance a gas-fired power plant at home. And if we don't solve this, we're going to just be replicating the old extractive colonial model where Africa's resources are used to help develop other regions, not to develop the local economies. Okay, let me go to the third big challenge. This says challenge 2, but it's challenge 3, which is we have to put climate change and emissions reduction in context. This is I think, relatively controversial, but important to understand. The first is that Africa is not the emissions problem. Okay, Africa, this is historic cumulative emissions. Africa is the blue square at the bottom. You often hear Africa is only responsible for about 3% of global emissions. In the current, it's about 4%, but it's a tiny fraction. This is, if you disaggregate even just a little bit, it becomes even starker. So South Africa obviously has much higher emissions than the rest of the continent. And if you for a second just exclude South Africa and the 5 North African countries, you're still left with 48 countries with over 1 billion people responsible for about half of 1% of global emissions. So, Africa is not responsible for historic emissions. It is not responsible for current emissions. And this has also led to some bizarre policy stances. We could talk about a lot of them, but the one I'm going to mention today is a lot of hypocrisy from the development community around gas finance. And here is a simple graph of natural gas consumption per capita. You can see Canada, the top gas consuming countries, this is per person, are Canada, United States, and then a whole bunch of European countries. African countries are all toward the bottom. Even countries we think of as fossil fuel economies, like Nigeria, Angola, maybe Cote d'Ivoire. These, on a per capita basis, they're absolutely tiny. And I would, one of the joys of being a former diplomat is you can say what you really think. And I think the United States, is in a very tricky position trying to encourage Africans not to exploit their own natural gas, because who is now the world's leading LNG exporter? It's not a Gulf state. It's not Saudi Arabia. It's the United States. And let me just say, if there is concern that those numbers of African gas could get big, that's actually incorrect. So if we did a little back of the envelope calculation, that if Africa tripled its electricity consumption and used only gas, okay, and no country would do that. No country is only going to use gas. But let's take an extreme example that Africa tripled electricity consumption and used only gas. The additional CO2 is 0.6% of world emissions. Now, China's emissions went up last year by more than that. So it's very clear that restrictions on fossil fuel finance for African countries, it will not help the planet. It's just too small to matter, but it will hurt African economies because it will hold them back from having the energy they need. So again, what could be done here? First would be not to apologize if Africa's emissions go up in the short term. With the exception of South Africa, which is a complete anomaly because of their coal dependence, higher emissions would be a good thing because of the development impact in most economies. The second is that a lot of countries can leverage their gas exports for low-cost power at home to develop cleaner fuels for cooking gas, and for industries, especially fertilizer, which uses gas as a feedstock. So countries that are developing gas should be negotiating very hard to make sure that there's those linkages to domestic industrial growth and job creation. And then just the very last thing I'll say before we turn to questions is that fundamentally, no energy, no economic growth. And we have got to get this right, or we are going to be leaving at least a quarter of humanity behind. And that is obviously unacceptable from a development, from an ethical, and from a national security standpoint for all of us. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd, for those very stark and thought-provoking messages. So let me now, first of all, let me acknowledge actually that a couple of our own, not advisors, but resource people are here. So Stefan Darkon, I want to acknowledge is here, and Trudy as well. So welcome, please. So friends, the floor is open. Questions. I'm sure you must have a lot of questions.